Hello and welcome to Sammy's Midnight Hour. I am your host Sam, and with me as always, my co-host.
And good evening, everyone.
Tonight we're talking about a serial killer like we talked about last week. His name's Herb Baumeister. He's from Indiana, also known as Herb, just Herb, and the I-70 Strangler. This says the 8/16. Some reported that it was somewhere along the lines of maybe 50. The date of murders was between 1980 and 1996. His date of birth was April 7th, 1947. His victims were Johnny Bayer, 20 years old, 28-year-old were Johnny Bayer, 20 years old, 28-year-old Alan Broussard, 33-year-old Roger Goodlett, 20-year-old Richard Hamilton, 26-year-old Stephen Hale, 31-year-old Jeff Allen Jones, 46-year-old Michael Kern, and 31-year-old Manuel Resendez, 31. His method of murder was strangulation. The location was between Indiana and Ohio. His status at the moment, he's not living. He committed suicide to avoid.
So let's talk about his early life. A lot of serial killers are just notorious to have bad upbringings, but this is not the case with Herb. The oldest of 4 children, Baumeister's childhood was evidently normal. By the onset of adolescence, however, he began exhibiting antisocial behavior. Later recalls the young Baumeister playing with dead animals and urinating on a teacher's desk. As a teenager, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but did not receive further psychiatric treatment. You know, that's kind of common, Sam, too, at that time,
Mm-hmm.
Back in that era of time.
Usually it has something to do with animals and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Wet and bad, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. As an adult, he drifted through a series of jobs marked by work ethic.
Yeah.
That was interesting, I thought.
So I was able to lead the double life.
Yes. But also by more increasingly bizarre behavior. We're going to talk about that throughout this podcast, so hang tight. So Herb was born April the 7th, 1947, to a doctor, Herbert, and of course his mother Elizabeth, in Currer, Ives, Butler, Tarkington area, Indiana. That was hard for me to say. A sister named Barbara was born in 1948, and 2 brothers. Barbara was born in 1948, and 2 brothers followed after. So Brad was in 1954, and Richard in 1956. As the father's medical practice progressed, he was an anesthesiologist. Look, I got that word out. The family eventually... Now, this is all in Indiana, right?
Yes.
Okay. Herbert's childhood seemed normal, according to the book, and this book is Where the Bodies Are Buried. Good book. I think Sam's read it.
Yeah, very good book.
It's by Fanny Weinstein and Melinda Wilson. However, they continued by the time he reached parent. The something about him wasn't quite right. A close school pal named Bill Donovan recalled that Herb would fall into strange things. He often had weird thoughts, pondering on repulsive things of human urine. After doing these strange things, one morning on the way to school, he picked up a dead crow that had been hit by a car, and he shoved it in his pocket. This is during school. This is like while I was
on
in
his
school.
way to school.
Yeah. Then while the teacher wasn't looking, he dropped it on her desk. This was just irresponsible, and just often this compulsive behavior was notorious for his childhood. Herb's behavior soon caught the attention of his father, who he sent him off for this mental evaluation. Being a doctor himself, he knew there was something wrong. He had a lengthy series of tests. Eventually, again, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia or schizophrenic, having two or more sided personality bases. However, there is no record of further treatment. This is so sad, because had he had treatment,
maybe things would have turned out a little different.
Yeah, wow. Because his high school, North Central, focused on sports activities, he was just an avid bookworm. Herb, he just couldn't fit in. He just could not get into the in, I'm putting up quote signs, the in crowd. He tried to be one of the boys, and he didn't blend in. He was a strange. He didn't blend in. He was a strange child. And this was recalled from this friend, this Donovan, the friend of his.
Yeah.
He withdrew to himself and spent many hours alone. As for his interest in datings, the friend Donovan said he had zero. This is quoted, zero. In his college years, he remained just ever so quiet and just very secluded. He dropped out his freshman year. He returned, and this is the thing. This man was smart. He had no reason.
High IQ.
He had a very high IQ. He had no reason that he would drop out.
Right.
He dropped out of his freshman year, returned for a semester here and a semester there. But throughout the next 4 years, he never graduated. He never graduated from college.
Right. Nevertheless, though, through his father's persistence, his father was a respected man. His father was a respected man in town. The Indianapolis Star, the major newspaper, hired teenage Herb on as a copy boy. Gary Donna, an advertising executive who worked for the paper, remembers that Herb was sensitive, kind of a sensitive kid, sensitive teenager. Sensitive teenager. As to the way he was viewed and treated by the higher ups, he obsessively wanted to be somebody. He dressed well and was eager, but again did not fit in. And that's always seemed to be the case with him. He just never quite fit into anything.
Right.
It seemed to be the case with him. He just never quite fit into anything.
Right.
One odd incident occurred when Herb offered to drive Donna and his friends to the IU football game in hopes that he might become one of the gang. And this is where things get a little bit odd, people.
We didn't mention that he went to IU.
Oh, yeah, he went to IU.
We didn't mention that. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sam. Go ahead.
Yeah, hopes that he might become one of the gang. When the day came, he showed up in a hearse. Probably acquired through connections with the hospital where his father worked, and with lights flashing, raced to the game, laughing all the way. Whew. People started pulling off the road, recalls Donna. He even wore a chauffeur's cap. He thought, wondered what kind of a nut bag was at the steering wheel.
Good grief. And the weirdness continues. And this is in Weinstein's and Wilson's book. It says it wasn't long after he started working for the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, another job that's kind of rumored, began ranting and raving at fellow employees for no apparent reason. His tenure over the years just marked very odd behavior, according to his former co-workers from the BMV. One Christmas, he raised a lot of eyebrows. Him and another guy dressed in drag. Now, despite his in-house personality conflicts and erratic deployment, the Bureau nonetheless noticed an apparent go-get-him attitude. That's the thing, is that he was a real, like I said,
hard worker.
Very, very hard worker. And a lot of really go-get-him attitude mixed with his high degree of intelligence. This man was very intelligent. It wasn't long after that he earned a title as the program director at the BMV, where others might have this point taken the challenge with an exerted professionalism. Herb increased and flourished, so he really flourished there. Herb had displayed that those who knew him, the characteristics, he was just bizarre and had a bizarre sense of humor, that's what coworkers are quoted as saying. So in Weinstein's book, and Weinstein-Williams' book, it says, quote, "While at the BMV, it took the form of urinating on his boss's desk. It was no secret around the office who the culprit was, still, to avoid being fired. Until this is what got him fired. He urinated on a letter addressed to the governor of Indiana.
That seems to be a pattern, the whole urination thing.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
In November 1971, Herb had married Julie Sater in the United Methodist Church in Indianapolis. Julie was a college graduate and was introduced to him by a mutual friend. She was attracted to the tall, light-haired, boy-faced Baumeister, and in their initial chat, they discovered that they shared many things in common. They had, a lot of things in common. Both were Republican. That they shared many things in common. They had, a lot of things in common. Both were Republican. Both yearned to have their own business one day. Julie quit her job as a high school journalism instructor in the latter half of the 1970s to concentrate on having a family. Besides, Herb was earning a decent wage at the BMV. 3 children followed. Mary in 1979, Eric in 1981, and Emily 3 years later. When Herb was asked to leave the BMV, the ever-faithful Julie returned to teaching to supplement her husband's income. Through an assortment of odd jobs, he eventually wound up working for a thrift shop. Although he felt menial at first, the whole job felt kind of menial to him at first, he soon realized the potential available in a place like that. He and Julie talked it over, and based on Herb's acquired knowledge of running such an outlet over the 3 years he worked there, decided to invest what money they had into their own store. They borrowed $4,000, which I'm sure a few of you might have heard that in Indiana, Save-A-Lot Thrift in conjunction with the highly respected Children's Bureau of Indianapolis. In Indianapolis, it was a charity benefiting the area's families. The shop, located on 46th Street, sold used clothing, household goods, and 6th Street sold used clothing, household goods, and a number of secondhand items. I think now it's like a food store. I think what Save-A-Lot is now. But
would it be like a Goodwill? Would that
it sounded like maybe kind of like an off Goodwill.
That's what I kind of thought too. Okay.
The inventory technically belonged to the charity, which in turn received a contracted percentage of the proceeds. Shoppers found that Save-A-Lot tidy and offering only quality merchandise. It became a popular shop, or a popular place to shop for families on a budget. In no time, Herb and Julie received high praises from the Children's Bureau, whose human cause greatly benefited from, earned $50,000, which is not too bad for the year.
Back
in 1988.
Right.
Soon they opened a second store, successful business people now. In 1991, the Baumeisters moved from their middle-class home into the fashionable Westfield district, nearly 20 miles from Indianapolis, in Hamilton County, where they bought on a contract an elegant Tudor-style home called Fox Hollow Farms, complete with 4 bedrooms, an indoor swimming pool, and riding stable. Its 18.5 acres provided the country tranquility in which Julie always hoped to be able to raise her children. The couple was living the so-called American dream on the surface. Herb always seemed to call the shots, and Julie always kind of went along for the ride, explains a friend of theirs named John Egloff. The Baumeister's one-time lawyer in Where the Bodies Are Buried, he discussed his perception of the couple. Whenever, it didn't matter what it was, whenever they disagreed about what should be done with respect to a particular matter, Herb would basically take over the conversation.
He'd say, Julie, that's not where we're going to do. Julie deferred to Herb, but she wasn't happy about it. More than once, the couple split up, and then briefly they went back together, and then they would split up. The house itself seemed to adopt a tension within its walls, and this is something that I think in the documentaries that we've watched, they don't touch on. This is something that I think in the documentaries that we've watched, they don't touch on that.
Not a lot.
They don't touch on that household was not happy, and there's a lot more to this. So neighbors and business associates who entered the Fox Hollow estate later recalled the rooms of being cluttered and unkept. They just lacked order, or more appropriate, they just ignored it. The once groomed grounds of the manor house became overgrown. Julie would often take the children to visit at Grandma Baumeister's weeks on end at her condominium on Lake Wawasee. Would tell their friends that Herb didn't get along because didn't go along, because of the business pressures. Later to be find out why he didn't go along. Yeah.
Why he didn't
go. But behind this I found really interesting. And this is something they don't touch on in the documentary either.
No.
Something that So behind the bedroom doors, there was very little intimacy in this marriage. Julie later admitted that she and Herb had engaged in sex only 6 times in the 25 years that they were married.
25 years.
That was quoted from Detective Vandegrift.
Right.
She was quoted in saying that. And according to the authors of, again, Weinstein and Wilson, Julie never saw her husband nude. Herb dressed in the bathroom.
25 years.
25 years, yeah. Some of us don't even want to see our spouses nude. No, I'm sorry. Herb dressed in the bathroom Herb dressed in the bathroom when it came time to go to bed. He would always put on pajamas, like slipping between the sheets. And it's quoted in saying that he was always ashamed of his very skinny or slender body. The wife, that something wasn't right. And the investigator, Vandegrift, adds that should have been a red flag. Reflecting again on those danger signals or those red flags that our mom always tells us about, and just bad things that were to come.
Right.
But Julie was an over-trusting woman who, despite their problems, put complete stock in her husband's actions. Julie, just probably in trying so hard to reconcile their differences, threw her own mental state into complete dependency on Herb. I think deep inside, she chose not to see the signs.
Had to have.
She chose not to see the signs.
She didn't want to.
And I think Vandegrift, the investigator, she agrees with that as well. She agrees with that. And that may be the reason why she believes that the alibi in 1994. Now, this is something they do talk about in the documentary. They have a son named Eric that was playing out in the family wooded area in this backyard. They had 18 acres, I believe, but they were playing out in the backyard. And he found complete human skeletal, just a skeleton laying, showing the gruesome discovery to his mother, Julie. Anxiously awaiting her husband's arrival that day home, from the shop. When she showed him, with curiosity, he explained it. He was monotoned. With curiosity, he explained it. He was monotoned. When he explained it, no emotions. And he said to her that it was from, now remember, his father was a doctor. And he explained that it was from his father's skeleton collection. And he had stored it in their garage and buried it in the yard only after he decided to clean out the garage. It was a simple explanation. Herb gave it to Julie. Enough said, and the subject was closed. He married in 1971 a union that produced 3 children. We talked about this. Chain in 1988. Just trying to give you a timeline here. The founders of Save-A-Lot, a serial killer, Herbert Richard Herb Baumeister, born April the 7th, 1947, and then again he committed suicide on July the 3rd, 1996. Was the founder of the thrift store chain, serial killer from the suburban Westfield in Indiana. He was well liked in his community. Yeah. That's the thing. He played the part.
He played the role.
He played the role because people didn't think. I mean, we'll get to that. I mean, it's a good story, so it's hard to.
1993, the police were contacted by a man claiming that a gay bar patron calling himself Brian Smart had killed a friend of his and had attempted to kill him. The detectives told him to contact them in case he never saw the man again. In November of 1995, he called them and supplied the man's license plate. So he actually he had went back to this bar and he had saw somebody else get into this car and he got the plates. After checking the license registry, Vandegrift and Wilson discovered that Brian Smart was actually Herb Baumeister. So by 1996, which that explains a lot, him going to a gay bar and only having sex with his wife 6 times in 25 years. And Wilson discovered that Brian Smart was actually Herb Baumeister. By June 1996, however, Julie had become sufficiently frightened by her husband's mood swings and erratic behavior that after filing for divorce, she yielded the remains of 11 men. Only 4 were ever identified, which that blows me away how only 4 men.
And there was no heads found.
No, there was no heads found.
No heads found.
There was the only one time that they found a skeleton. That was, or a skull was at the first one when that child found it. When their kid was at the first one when that child found it. When their kid found it. That's the only time. The rest of them, none of the skulls were with them. Mm-hmm. Panicked, Baumeister escaped to Ontario, where he committed suicide at Pinery Provincial Park. In his suicide note, he described his failing marriage and business as his reason for killing himself. But never, not once, did he confess to killing anybody or having known anything about any of those 7 men found in his backyard.
Wasn't the suicide note 3 pages long?
3 pages long is what they found.
Okay.
They found a 3-page long suicide note.
That's what I thought.
In addition to the murders at his estate, on the documentaries, they said that he could have killed up to, they think up to 50 men. Mm-hmm. And maybe more. Mm-hmm. The bodies of whom were found in a rural area along the corridor of Interstate 70 that was between Indiana and Ohio, and also between Indianapolis and Columbus. Julie Baumeister told authorities that her husband made as many as 100 business trips to Ohio on what he said was store business.
3 years after police found piles, think about that, piles of human remains on the Indiana horse ranch. DNA testing had allowed investigators to identify 8 men who were killed and dumped there. Police say that Herb continued to live in his facade. His marriage to Julie on the surface normalcy, and their 2 Save-A-Lot stores continued to occupy much of their daylight time. It's just up until the mid-1990s been visible to others what was going on and what was about to manifest. The strains of this sexless, loveless marriage were appearing. I feel for Julie. I do. Julie, people at home and in the neighborhoods were talking as well. And I think it says later on, too, that we're going to talk about, but it's hard not to jump ahead.
Right.
Because it's such an exciting story. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
Let me get right back on where we're at here. So in 1994, the Save-A-Lots had taken a plunge. So the shoppers had declined. The bills were soaring. Can you imagine? They lived on an 18-acre mansion, and this mansion, we've got pictures on the PowerPoint presentation of their mansion. Well, it's got an in-ground pool for crying out loud.
Inside.
So, yes, exactly. Not an in-ground pool outside.
No,
inside. Right. Ground pool outside.
No,
inside.
Inside.
Right. So Julie tried, she was just tired of the bickering, the financial dilemmas, and this fairy tale, and I have parentheses up, my little fingers, life that just never quite matched Cinderella. So she threatened divorce as another stranger. And we have seen this with other serial killers, that they start out slow, and then it gets stranger and more in depth.
Weird.
Yes,
and
we've
they just
seen
get
this.
a little bit more weird.
Yes.
Their antics get a little bit more out there.
Exactly. So at the workplace, Herb he demanded grueling work and unfair attention from them, acting as if he was some sort of king who deserved to be praised. He fired people who wouldn't comply and to this treatment. He just said, "You're out." And his own work days. Now this is important. His own work days were. Now this is important. His own work days were filled full of this farceness. He would disappear for hours. Employees are quoted as saying, then he would return just reeking of alcohol and just barking out orders to everybody. This once tidy, wonderful, just a mess. And it's quoted that the employee said that there was no attention to it. Everything was just dirty. One clerk said, remembers this, everything that you just looked at was just a mountain of garbage bags. It was like working in a garbage heap. A year had passed, and Virgil Vandegrift and Mary Wilson had begun their search for this man named Brian Smart. And this is what his alias was when he would go into the gay bars, was Brian Smart. His real identity and his house of mannequins, his identity and his house of mannequins, his mansion of mannequins remained a mystery.
That's another thing, too, when they were watching the documentaries, these weird mannequins, the guys he would bring home would comment on these weird mannequins. And and of course, he always told them would comment on these weird mannequins. And and of course, he always told them that that wasn't his house, that was his boss's house.
Right.
And that those mannequins were there for his boss, so his boss wouldn't feel lonely.
Now, ladies,
which is just odd.
I'm kind of speaking to the ladies. Y'all can't tell me that you wouldn't think it was strange if you had this. Y'all can't tell me that you wouldn't think it was strange if you had this huge mansion and your husband had all these mannequins all over the house.
Right.
I'm sorry. That is just
That'd be a hard thing to explain.
That's too much.
On July 23rd, Julie called her lawyer, Bill Windling, and told him to get in touch with Mary's son Eric visiting his mother at Lake Wawasee. And she wanted to take this opportunity to tell Mary about the bones she had found in her backyard, the ones that she'd found, or her son had found. The following day after Julie's lawyer notified her, Mary Wilson drove anxiously to Fox Hollow Farms. Accompanying her were two very skeptical Hamilton County officials of the county sheriff's office and a detective, Jeff Markham. In truth, Anderson was not sure that the human remains Wilson hoped to find would turn out to be animal remains. He was not too shy, even to Mary's face, to directly apprise the woman's suspicions as bullshit. Which, I mean, that's just not an attitude to have at all. That's just not an attitude to have at all. Julie Baumeister, with attorney Windling at her side, met the law enforcement people at her front door that afternoon and led them through the house to the wooded backyard. There she pointed to the spot where 2 years earlier her son Eric had found a skeleton, and it looked like somebody just laid down and died. How it was positioned. Mm-hmm. The reason she had not notified the authorities until now, she claims, was because she believed what Herb told her. She said he was a pack rat and kept everything, so she figured that's what it was his dad's skeleton. Mm-hmm. The bones being no more than a dissecting skeleton. His recent erratic actions, however, filled her with new doubts. The yard at first glance looked normal, but as the men began to kick through the low grass and patches of dirt just beyond the back patio, they encountered a bone about a foot long, charred from having been burned. They weren't foot long, charred from having been burned. They weren't sure if it was human. Then as their eyes focused on the area immediately around them, it quickly became apparent that those many pebbles and rocks strewn across the flat cover were not pebbles and rocks at all. But fragments of bone. Lawyer Bill Windling, watching the police, scooped up one chip and broken bone after another, now looked down at his own feet, like the evidence that followed the old adage, so obvious it's unclear. He realized in a chill that he too was standing on what resembled bone chips. Where the Baumeister, it just kept getting closer.
Yeah, he kept burying them closer and closer to the back.
Closer and closer to the house. Yep.
Right. Okay.
He would just, and at one point he just stopped burying them. He just thrown them.
At one point, he leaned over to pick up. This is the attorney. He picked up what were obviously human teeth. He's picking up human teeth.
They're just out there, right there in the open.
Pieces of bone lay everywhere. Still, the county people on site were unconvinced that what they were gathering and taking photographs of were human. She'd seen firsthand how nervous Herb had been and how he had done everything off his land, including lying to Julie about their investigation. Now, she knew why. She delivered the bags of evidence to the forensic anthropologist Stephen Naraki at University of Indiana for examination. He answered very fast. He says, they are human. He answered very fast. He says, they are human remains. They are recent, and they've been buried, or burned and buried. The next day, the police returned to the scene of what looked like one of the worst crime scenes Indiana had ever encountered. It began to appear to them now that Herb's whole homestead was this graveyard, might contain the remains of those many young homosexuals who over several years had vanished from the streets of Indianapolis. This time, a thorough dig of the premises along the group was a prosecuting attorney named Sonia Learcamp and a half score of detectives. Naraki, now this is the forensic pathologist, came to, and two assistants, Matt Williamson and Christopher Schmidt, to perform the scientific exhumation, is that how you say that? Of what was obviously just a secret cemetery. The anthropological team began the hunt by placing small orange flags into the ground wherever the bone fragments would appear. In only a half an hour, they dropped nearly 100 of these markers in the ground. Summing it up, Naraki explained it looks like a mass disaster from a plane crash.
Right.
That's what he was trying to explain.
Right.
While the dig continued into the late hours, with policemen checked out the interior of the Baumeister home, they found, again, the mannequins. Yeah, the mannequins. The wet bar. The pool. Just as Tony Harris, that's the eyewitness, correct?
Right. The guy that was there with him.
Right, had described to them. However, they uncovered something that Tony didn't know. Tony hadn't seen that evening that Baumeister had a semi-hidden video camera. Now, this I have not seen in any documentaries. I've never seen him talk about this. This is so interesting that we uncovered this. A semi-hidden video camera that the police immediately suspected had been used to tape the strangulations. The case was turning into this bizarre, just every hour that, okay. And was at, at the lake at Wasap. How do you say that again? Wawasi. I'm glad you can say it. Reality started to seep in, and Julie feared that she didn't know what the limits Herbert might go. Especially if he found out what was happening at their home. So, probably moved the boy, which was Eric, from the father's presence. Efforts were made by Baumeister to hold on to his son, but came to no avail. He had no reason to suspect that his secret had been literally uncovered in the backyard at Fox Hollow. And he figured this custody action was just in the backyard at Fox Hollow. And he figured this custody action was just a ploy by Julie to counteract his latest divorce movement. So when police showed up with the proper papers to escort the child, which was Eric, home, Herb released him calmly and without menace. Back to the estate, plenty was happening. And without menace. Back to the estate, plenty was happening. County investigators, led by sheriff detectives Kenneth Wisman, were beginning to put pieces of Herb's puzzle together. Compost piles yielded heavy degrees of bones, where it appeared the killer had burnt his corpses under piles of leaves and garbage. They interviewed Tony Harris. Now that's that guy again that saw him at he actually was at the house.
He was with him.
That's right. Yeah. Who told them that Herb had an obsession with asphyxiation. A big question they had: how could Herb have strangled and burned and buried these men without his family's knowledge? was answered in an interview with Julie herself. She explained that sometimes, for several months at a time, especially in the summer, she and her children visited the widow Baumeister, which would have been Herb's mother, right? Yeah, leaving Herb alone, balancing the times of the victim's disappearances with the period that she was gone. He would do these things while she was away. He would do these things while she was away. And if she was away for months at a time, he had plenty of time.
Plenty of time
to bring them back. Yeah.
Hide things.
He had plenty of time. Yeah.
Meanwhile, the excavations in the backyard went on without pause. The number of diggers had swelled to about 60 volunteers. The first couple of days, researchers had produced an amazing 5,500 bones, teeth and bone fragments, which, according to Nawrocki, made up 4 bodies. Whew, that's a lot of bones. After they had combed the entire 18 acres of the Baumeister's property, members of the team were soon to learn that their search was from an adjacent farm crossed into the police cordon to inform them that they had found evidence of yet more bones next door. He was going next door. I mean, his property was getting so full, he went next door. Mm-hmm. They led investigators to an area cut through with a drainage ditch that separated the two properties. Here in this ditch were so many human ribs, vertebrae, and spines that one of the officials murmured, "Jesus Christ, they're everywhere." The bones were so numerous and more intact than on the Baumeister land that they actually stuck up visibly from the mud. Not only more bones, but with them cans of Miller Genuine Draft Beer, which was Herb's favorite beer, and handcuffs that had probably bound the victims in death. By the time exhumation of this area ended, and by the time that the 140 bones were estimated and those belonging to another 7 men, the mortal count had men killed. It would be September before the anthropologists were able to identify some of the bodies. Disappointingly, only 4, which I'm still having trouble with that, and each of these gathered from dental records. The 4 positively identified victims' names were Roger Goodlet, Stephen Hale, Richard Hamilton, and Manuel Resendez. Roger Goodlet's mother is the one that got all this rolling.
Yes.
Because if it hadn't been for her,
thank the Lord for her.
This would have all went undetected,
mm-hmm.
and would
she
have
wanted
been
her
sad.
son back.
Well, she loved her son.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
and would
she
have
wanted
been
her
sad.
son back.
Well, she loved her son.
Yeah, she loved her son.
She
loved her son back.
And none of this would have been in motion had she not opened her mouth. It says this day the remains of others found at Fox Hollow Farms wait to be identified.
And I still think they've not been identified. Correct?
As far as I know, no.
I still think they've not been identified, correct?
As far as I know, no. Because this case is, which is amazing. This case is still open, and all because of what
I'm about to talk about now.
Is dead. So
right. So the big question is, but where is Herb Baumeister? He had left Lake Wasasi, and like his victims, faded into the mist. The only clue the police had from Brad Baumeister, which was Herb's brother, he called Detective Wisman on June the 29th, 5 days after the police found the graveyard behind the house, but phoned him from a little town in Michigan, Fenville, saying that he was on a business trip and he needed money. He needed money quickly. After Brad sent the cash, he became aware of the goings-on at Fox Hollow and notified the authorities immediately. Herb, in his 1989 gray Buick, left Wawasee and headed north, arriving at Fenville around the 28th of June. The next day, he reached Port Huron, where, again, he phoned Brad again, which is his brother, asking for more money. By this time, Brad had spoken to brother, should he call again, to tell him to call the police, that they wanted to talk to him. You know, it was a futile request, but he figured it was worth trying. At this point, the fugitive had entered Canada, and Weinstein and Wilson reported in their books, Ontario Province. They believed Herb arrived in Sanaria on June the 30th, spending several days there before driving east along Lake Huron shoreline to Grand Bend, Ontario. There in Pinery Park, on the evening of June 3rd, Herb would take his last life, his own. He put a .357 Magnum revolver barrel to his forehead and pulled the trigger. The note he left behind and just talked about his decision about his failing businesses, his marriage falling apart, but there was never a mention of the skeletons left behind in Westfield. Instead, his final words on this 3-page suicide document explain that he would now eat a peanut butter sandwich, his favorite snack, and then he would go to... A Canadian trooper had stopped him to ask why he was sleeping in his car under a nearby bridge. He told her that he was merely a tourist passing through and he was just grabbing a moment of rest. At this time, she noted some luggage and what looked like a pile of videotapes in the back seat. Now, we're going to talk about this, but where are these videotapes? I mean, and were these the videotapes of the murders that he committed at the pool area on Fox Hollow Farm? The pool area on Fox Hollow Farm. The private investigator asked, Virgil Vandegrift asked this question, but we will never know. For after he died, there was no sign of the videotapes on him, nor in his car. He must have tossed them in the lake before he shot himself. I know that the detective is quoted in saying that perhaps it was best, but I have to wonder if it would have helped to identify these young men.
It would have. Yep.
It could have helped to identify them.
Anything would have helped.
Yeah,
anything
definitely.
other than just nothing.
Right.
The testing also determined that the bodies of 11 people, not 7 as previously believed, were scattered in a wooded area at Herb Baumeister's Fox Hollow Farm. Baumeister, believed to be responsible for the slayings, committed suicide. Hamilton County Sheriff Sergeant Eddie Moore said, investigators now have the difficult task of trying to identify the remaining 3 victims. The problem is we're not sure who they are, so we have no names to even start on. No comparison, no DNA samples, Moore told APBnews.com today. The 8 men whose bodies were identified through DNA testing were reported missing, and samples of relatives' DNA were available, he said. The victims' identities were determined through tests that University of Indianapolis forensic anthropologist Stephen Naraki performed on bones and teeth. Moore said. DNA testing found the remains of 11 people on the Indiana ranch that Julie gave permission to search. Hamilton County Sheriff investigators found the human remains at Fox Hollow Farms after going there on June 24, 1996. During a police investigation, the detective was working on some missing people, and her investigation kept coming back to Baumeister's name. That's what Moore said from the sheriff's the sheriff investigator. He talked to Baumeister's wife, Julie, when they went out to his home, and she gave investigators permission to search the property, Moore said. They found bones and body parts covered with leaves on top, he said. It was mostly bones. All the flesh and whatnot was eaten away. There was little in the way of artifacts like watches and clothing.
Herb was in his mid-30s and ran an Indianapolis thrift shop with his wife, and this was Julie. He went to Canada in 1996. Investigators say that they are unsure what Herb's motive was, but they do believe that he acted alone. It's hard to say what was going on in his head. Most of these men, most of all of them, they frequented the gay or an alternative life in Indianapolis. Dental records enabled investigators to identify only 4 of the slain victims, not long after the remains were found. Then last year, Hamilton County officials contributed $15,000 to $20,000 just to help with the DNA cost. DNA testing on the remains. Hamilton County Sheriff's investigators released the remains of the families of the 8 identified victims on June the 8th. However, Sheriff Joe Cook waited a week. Before releasing the news of the test